Welcome. This is RJ Game News USA, and I'm starting a little mini series on the Super Bowl and the history of the Super Bowl. No, I'm not going over all the technical details about how the game started or who decided what name something was or how this came about. I'm just going to take a look at the games. And in today's first chapter, we're going to look at the early years of the Super Bowl. We're going to look at Super Bowl 1 through 10. So, if you like this kind of content, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Now, for full transparency, I was not born yet between Super Bowl 1 and 10. A lot of my memories of those Super Bowls were years later on Super Bowl highlights, and a lot of those just showed a lot of the plays in slow motion. And it's hard to even remember what those kind of games would look like in normal speed. Um, but I do have thoughts on each of these games and what happened and what I thought about the historical impact of these games. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. Super Bowl 1 was a matchup between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Green Bay Packers. And the Packers won the game 35 to 10. Um, they were 14-point favorites. They more than covered the spread. Vince Lombardi had become a household name. Eventually, the trophy would be named after him. Um, and when it comes to the NFL, prior to this game, for the most part, I am not too familiar on NFL history. I am a little bit. But there was a whole half a century of football the NFL had prior to the Super Bowl. And in the lead up to the Super Bowl, the Packers were a very dominant team in the 60s. Many still consider them the best dynasty of all time. It's hard to argue with 5 championships in 7 years. But they did win this first Super Bowl. The game was split on CBS and NBC broadcast wise, which was very unique. We'll never see anything like that again. There wasn't too much pomp and circumstance behind the game itself. People still viewed the NFL championship as the championship. They always viewed the AFL as the little brother league, a league that was formed out of the popularity the NFL was gaining out of the late 1950s thanks to Johnny Unitas and the greatest game ever played versus the Giants in 1958. The AFL was a more loose league, considered a more fun league, a more pass-friendly league. The NFL was still rooted in running the ball. Now, that being said, the MVP of this game was Bart Starr, who was the quarterback for the Packers, an all-time legend. Now, his statistics don't hold up very well to today's standard, but that's not how you judge a quarterback's standards. You have to look at the era they played. And almost nobody won more championships than Bart Starr. And so I think Super Bowl 1, other than being the very first Super Bowl, isn't quite well remembered for exactly what it did. It was just sort of remembered for being the first. Kind of like George Washington as far as president goes. I think there was better presidents after Washington. There's clearly been better Super Bowls after this. But it was the first. And that is something. So we will move on to Super Bowl 2. This same Green Bay Packers team, also again favored by 14, defeated the Oakland Raiders 33 to 14. An interesting fact here though, The Raiders in the AFL were actually 13-1 that year. Actually, they might have been 13-0 before that game. Back then, you only played 12 regular season games, and you had basically two divisions. This is how it worked for both leagues. And if you won your division, you went into the championship game. So going into this game, the Raiders were actually an undefeated 13-0. And the Packers were surprisingly only 9-4-1. But they did enough to win the NFL championship. Vince Lombardi got his final NFL championship before retiring. And there were 75,000 people in attendance. Bart Starr was named the MVP again. He went back-to-back Super Bowl MVPs. So that's notable. And that was kind of the end of the Packers' run and kind of the end of their dynasty. The tail end of the NFL pre-Super Bowl going into the NFL post-Super Bowl. Now at this point, the AFL had yet to score victory or even be competitive in the Super Bowl. It was believed by many the NFL was the superior league. However, Super Bowl III would change things. Big time. So we go to Super Bowl III. The New York Jets defeated the Baltimore Colts 16-7. And this was one of the more shocking upsets in the history of sports. Joe Namath famously predicted that they would win the game. He guaranteed it. And they did. Now, it wasn't exactly a barn burner. The game itself wasn't that entertaining. It was a 16-7 contest. Don Shula was the Colts head coach. They had a team that finished the year 13-1. They were widely considered easily the favorites. They were favored by 18 points over the Jets. It's probably the biggest favorite going in to any Super Bowl. The year was January 1969. Culture was changing. Johnny Unitas, the Baltimore Colts quarterback, represented the old crew cut, military style general on the football field. At that point, the GOAT. He was well ahead of his time, but time had caught up. He was injured most of the year, and Earl Morrall had stepped in to be quarterback and had his own NFL MVP season. Now, what's particularly crazy about this is, remember, this is before the era of free agency. The fact the Baltimore Colts were able to have Earl Morrall and Johnny Unitas on the same team is downright criminal. That would be the equivalent of having Patrick Mahomes as your starter, and he goes down with injury, and your backup is Lamar Jackson. It just ain't fair. And the Colts had no business losing this game. But they did. Mostly because Earl Morrall threw 3 interceptions or 4 interceptions or something like that and completely shit the bed. I mean, this game is also super famous for establishing the AFL has actual equal footing competition to the NFL. So it was a big deal. Without this game, who knows how history would have played out. So we will continue onward to Super Bowl IV. This is the last Super Bowl before the leagues officially merged. And this is the first Super Bowl loss that breaks the heart of every Minnesota Vikings fan. Because the Kansas City Chiefs pulled off Another AFL upset on the NFL, 23-7. Hank Stram had those boys working that day, defeating Bud Grant's Vikings. The Vikings are favored by 13.5. The game was played in New Orleans. Didn't help. The Chiefs whooped some butt that day. Absolutely they did. For their first Super Bowl championship. And the MVP was Len Dawson, who for the longest time was the greatest Chiefs quarterback of all time before we know who came along. And now we move on to Super Bowl V. The Baltimore Colts defeat the Dallas Cowboys 16-13. Don Shula was no longer the head coach. This was Tom Landry and the Cowboys' first appearance in the Super Bowl. The Baltimore Colts were able to actually win the game. It was actually very close Vegas odds. Colts were favored by 2.5. They barely covered with the 3. This game is mostly known for the fact there was like 10 turnovers. Like, this game was so sloppy. This game was so, like, crazy. Like, if you wanted to see the Blunder Bowl, this is the game to watch. It was just absolutely nuts. And this is the only Super Bowl where a losing player won Super Bowl MVP. Chuck Howley, a linebacker for the Cowboys. Just one of these really odd Super Bowls. One that many people just completely forget about. It is Johnny Unitas' Super Bowl. He was still hanging around. We thought he was old after Super Bowl III. He won a Super Bowl. He's more known for the 3 NFL championships he had before that. Or the 3 MVPs he had before that. Just all around weird situation. I think this is also a situation where Unitas actually went down in the game and Morrill had to come in versus Super Bowl III. Morrill went down or got benched and Unitas came in. But the NFL's future was bright. We had our first close Super Bowl. However, I cannot say the same thing for Super Bowl VI. You'll notice a theme over time. Teams that lose the Super Bowl sometimes, especially in the early years, get right back there. Remember, there wasn't a lot of like teams transferring. Free agency wasn't a thing, like I've said. But Super Bowl VI, the Dallas Cowboys defeated the Miami Dolphins 24-3. Tom Landry avenged his loss from the previous year over head coach Don Shula of the Dolphins, who would now be 0-2 in Super Bowls. And Roger Staubach was MVP. Many old heads swear up and down he's one of the best. I think he's pretty good for his era. I think he's probably the second best quarterback in the 70s. But they swear by him. Cowboys are favored by 6, and they covered 81,000 in attendance. CBS carried the game. CBS has carried most of the Super Bowl games throughout history. The most, I should say. However, following this loss, it leads us to Super Bowl VII, which was won by the Miami Dolphins 14-7 after completing the only undefeated season in NFL history. Shockingly enough, as long as the NFL's been around, the 50 years before this And the 50 plus years after this, the only undefeated team was Don Shula's Miami Dolphins in that Super Bowl VII season, defeating the Redskins 14-7. 90,000 in attendance for the Super Bowl. And the MVP was Jake Scott, a safety. Props to the Dolphins. Every year they still pop that champagne, who's ever still a surviving member, every time the last undefeated team loses. I don't know if that'll ever change. So moving on to Super Bowl VIII, the Miami Dolphins followed up their undefeated season by winning yet another Super Bowl, going back-to-back. The first back-to-back team since the Green Bay Packers in Super Bowl I and II. And again, the Minnesota Vikings, I apologize, you're going to come up a lot. You lost 24-7. Oh boy, you can only feel bad for the Vikings, huh? And the MVP was Larry Csonka, who was just an absolute monster to try to tackle. Can the Vikings catch a break? Let's find out. Super Bowl IX. So Super Bowl IX rolls around, and the loser again is the Minnesota Vikings, 16-6 to the Pittsburgh Steelers, who would win their first of 4 Super Bowls in 6 years and start their dynasty. Franco Harris was the MVP. The Steelers were loaded with Hall of Famers. They came out of nowhere, but they were starting to build something great. And those poor Vikings lost their 3rd Super Bowl. Sad. We can't feel sorry enough for those damn Vikings, can we? And that leads us to Super Bowl X, where the Pittsburgh Steelers go back-to-back, defeating the Dallas Cowboys 21-17. This was considered a hell of a rivalry. Funny enough, we've seen plenty of Super Bowl rematches over the years. Steelers, Cowboys. We've seen 49ers, Chiefs. Patriots, Rams. We've seen Eagles, Chiefs. Bills, Cowboys. And correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe any team has faced 3 times. Oh, wait, except one. Cowboys Steelers did 3 times. And this was the first of 3 meetings. 2 back in the day and 1 more modern. But what a game. When you count the number of Hall of Famers in this game, it's absurd. Just absurd. Lynn Swann was the MVP. He made an absolute spectacular catch. The game was played in Miami in front of 80,000. And boy, was it a good Super Bowl. Probably the best one out of the first 10. But again, with these first 10 Super Bowls, I didn't really, obviously I wasn't born, so I didn't get to watch these happen in real time. So, but I do feel a connection to these early Super Bowls too. I feel like the game might have been different, but the mentality of wanting to win a championship never changes. And so I know these first 10 Super Bowls like the back of my hand because I love history. I love football. This is the history of football. Thank you for watching part one. Much appreciated. In part two, we will discuss Super Bowl 11 through 20. So please stay tuned for that. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, especially if you were old enough to watch any of the first 10 Super Bowls live. What did you think of it? Just let me know. And with that, guys, I'm out. RJ, signing out. Have a good one.